You're here to learn about ACEs and data. Bingo, you are in the right place. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Time is now 10:30. So in respect to everyone's time, we like to begin on time and we like to end on time. And we're going to go ahead and begin. My name is Derek Newby, and I'm a TTA specialist for Region 6 of the PTTC. And it means training and technical assistance. So during this online session, we'll be demonstrating to you how adverse childhood experiences data can be used to identify risk factors that contribute to substance misuse in a community, and how the data can be used by prevention professionals to plan. Using ACE data to impact substance misuse prevention allows for targeted interventions, a trauma-informed approach for your work, and an informed policy decision-making process. It helps identify individuals at higher risk. It addresses underlying factors, and it promotes early intervention and support, ultimately reducing the likelihood of substance misuse and its associated negative consequences. Exposure to traumatic experiences during childhood, or adverse childhood experiences as it is called, is not uncommon. And studies estimate that 1 in 6 people report 4 or more types of ACEs. So many of you will be able to apply what you learn here today to your work. This training, again, assumes that you have a basic knowledge of adverse childhood experiences theory, but still, in the beginning, we will be providing you with an overview. Next slide. This is our acknowledgement. It clearly states that the opinions expressed here are those of the PTTC network, and they do not reflect the official position of the Department of Human Services or SAMHSA. So no official support or endorsement from DHHS or SAMHSA is a part of this presentation. The opinions that you see expressed here are those of the PTTC, and it should not be inferred that this is the official perspective or view of SAMHSA. And this work is supported by grants from the Department of Health and Human Services and from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, better known as SAMHSA. Next slide. Iris Smith. Dr. Iris Smith is an associate professor emeritus at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, where she has taught graduate courses in program evaluation, substance abuse, social determinants of health, and mental health capstone courses. In addition to teaching, Dr. Smith has served as the coordinator for the Center for the Application of Prevention Technologies, or CAPT, for the Southeast Resource Team. In this role, she supervised a team of training and technical assistance specialists, content experts, and consultants who provided training and technical assistance to substance abuse and mental health services state grantees. Prior to coming to Emory, she was the director of the National Evaluation Services for the American Cancer Society, and she also served as a deputy commissioner for the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice. From 1979 to 1992, Iris was principal and co-investigator on a number of studies on prenatal drug exposure and intervention for substance abusing women and their children at Emory University School of Medicine. Her accomplishments include design, implementation, and evaluation of outreach interventions and treatment programs for substance abuse in women and their children. Dr. Smith expertise includes substance abuse prevention and treatment and juvenile justice and program evaluation. Without further ado, I give you our facilitator for today, Dr. Iris Smith.
Hi, everybody. Well, that was quite some introduction, Derek. I didn't expect you to read all that, but I'm happy to be here. And I think Derek has introduced the content of today's webinar very well. What you see in front of you now is our roadmap for today to kind of give you a sense of where we're going to be going the process of this webinar. I'm going to talk about the learning objectives in a moment. But as we get into the presentation, I'll be providing an overview of the ACE study. And I know many of you are already familiar with adverse childhood experiences, or ACE. But for those of you who may not be as familiar, I'll be talking about some of the basic findings from some of the research. And we'll talk about identifying risk factors. And then as we get into actually taking all this information and doing something with it in terms of prevention planning, we'll be talking about expanding our framework for prevention and kind of reconceptualizing what we do now as preventionists. And then I'll talk about evaluation and planning for that. And then I think Derek will come back and talk to you about some resources that we have available. And there will be opportunities during the webinar for you to ask questions or provide some feedback to us, or to share information with other participants. So the learning objectives for today's webinar are, first of all, to demonstrate how adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs data, can be used to identify the risk factors that contribute to substance misuse in a community. We'll describe how ACE data can be used to measure the impact of prevention efforts. And one thing I'll say now, and we'll talk about it more, is that much of the work you're already doing actually will impact ACE in your communities. And we're going to talk about that some. And then I'll kind of walk you through the basics of creating a plan that you can use in your community with community-led prevention efforts. So to start off, I'm just going to talk about ACE a little bit and the science behind it. The original ACE study was done in 1998. And you see before you the two co-researchers or co-investigators of the original study, Dr. Robert Anda and Vincent Folletti. And the original study is one of the largest of its kind and had over 17,000 study participants. And the participants were drawn from patients who were enrolled in the Kaiser Permanente case management system. So these were obviously people who had insurance, generally were employed. Income data suggests that they were probably in the mid to upper range in terms of income. So a population that we would normally think of as being low risk, which is why this was such a startling study. What they found, as many of you already know, is that experiences in early life and even preconceptual influences can also increase the risk for physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. Many of you may be familiar also with this, what we call the ACE pyramid. And the ACE pyramid has actually developed over time as we've begun to do more research on ACEs and the long-term impacts. And it really shows how we're talking about something that is has an entire life influence. So if you look at the bottom row of this pyramid, you see historical and intergenerational adversity. The original ACE study was done retrospectively, meaning that the researchers were asking participants about their history and their experience during childhood, and they were now adults, of course, experiencing some of the health problems that have been associated with ACE. We don't have a lot of studies that have really been done prospectively, but we're generating a lot of research on this on almost a daily basis. So basically what we know from the research that has been done is that early stress and trauma is predictive of not only emotional impact, but there are also predictable patterns of brain development that lead to certain kinds of character traits or personality traits and types of responses to stress, which can be maladaptive. So often when you have children who've been exposed to some kind of adverse event, you see delayed development, slowed language, problems with attention sometimes, inability to organize, and navigate life, deal with stress, and so forth, and sometimes aggressive behavior. So those neurodevelopmental changes then affect your social and emotional cognitive functioning. So you think of it as a feedback loop. Children who have difficulty adjusting or recovering from a traumatic experience may become very depressed, may become more aggressive, and so on and so forth. Those behaviors then may lead them to develop health risk behaviors, substance use included, and I'll talk more about what some of the research has found. And then in the long term, you see disease, mortality, disability, and other social problems. So ACEs are very important to focus on because obviously the effects are very widespread and they occur throughout the lifespan. So what you're looking at now is an estimate of the disorders that we could prevent if we could prevent ACE, I'm sorry. And if you look, you see things like drinking and driving, which of course we work on as preventionists. But here, 45% of those occurrences in the past 30 days, based on the behavioral risk factors surveillance data, could be prevented if we could prevent adverse childhood experiences. So that oil spill, if you will, kind of demonstrates where we can make an impact on these various things. And there are many things here that are included, which we don't often think of as being influenced by an adverse childhood experience. For example, diabetes, which is a medical issue, but often people who are diabetic can have their diabetes become more severe or experience more severe symptoms of diabetes because of childhood experiences, particularly those children who are diagnosed early. So when you think about prevention, we can have a really significant impact in a lot of areas if we can address the whole issue of adverse childhood experiences. Now, between 1998, when the original study was published, and 2021, there have been, based on a bibliometric analysis that was done at that time, they've been 789 articles on ACEs appearing in over 351 different journals around the world. So we've learned a lot about ACEs based on that original study. And a recent study also done looking at data from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, or BRFIS as we call it, collected from 25 states, estimated, as Derek has indicated, 1 in 6, or 15.6% of those studied had experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. And again, the kinds of impacts that we look at with ACEs are very widespread. Now, this slide gives you a sense of what we call a dose-response relationship. And basically what that means is the more experience you've had, more adverse experiences you've had, the higher your risk is for the poor outcomes that we've already discussed. There are a couple of things I want to say here. One is that in the original study, they were looking at history and not looking at the cumulative effect over the lifespan of an individual. The more, clearly we talk about childhood because that's our focus, but you can have adverse experiences up until the time you die. And we haven't really got a handle on what that means in terms of outcomes. But if we look just at the number of experiences that people report, you can see clearly that the more you have, the more health problems you are likely to experience. This slide looks at the various kinds of outcomes, negative outcomes, and they're grouped into 3 basic categories. There are the health conditions, which as preventionists, we don't directly address necessarily. Of course, mental illness, we do target mental illness and depression in young people. But if you look at the health risk behaviors, current smoking, heavy drinking, clearly that's in our wheelhouse. So those are the things that we focus on. And the heavy drinking in particular, not only by the individual, the young person or adolescents, but also within the family and within the community. There's also drug use. All of those things are influenced by adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These risk factors then will result in some of these socioeconomic kinds of challenges as the children reach adulthood. They're less likely to be employed because they may have a number of behavioral problems that prevent them from really holding down a job or finding a job. There is some relationship between academic achievement and the experience of ACEs. They tend to be of a lower the more you have, the more likely they are to have no health insurance and maybe be at a lower socioeconomic level than others who have not had these experiences. That's a lot. That's really a lot to talk about. When we think about ACEs, it's a big problem, obviously. And as prevention specialists, we don't follow people for their entire lives. We generally focus on a particular time period within their life, a particular age group. And so in the past, we've not really thought about what we do in the context of what can happen to people over the course of their lives. So preventing, identifying, and responding to ACEs when they occur should be one of our priorities, because in so doing, we're going to prevent a lot of other very poor outcomes. So including ACE data helps us to look across the spectrum in terms of areas of impact, and things like overdose, for example, suicide, involvement with law enforcement. Those kinds of things are also associated with ACEs, with the experience of ACEs in the long term. Preventing adverse experiences may mean changing the environment. And that's where this quote comes in. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Sometimes that's what's needed, is a fix in the community, particularly when we talk about things like community level violence, for example, which is an ACE. It was not one of the original things that were looked at in the original research study, but we know that children who live in communities where there's a high level of violence are traumatized. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is really expanding what we think of when we think of ACEs and looking at the ways in which we can impact them on a number of different levels. I mentioned violence. One recent study, for example, showed that overall, approximately 20% of students have witnessed community violence. And almost 4% of students have carried a gun. And these results are more pronounced for American Indian, Alaska Native, Blacks, and Hispanic students. And they were more likely to witness the violence and to report carrying a gun. So those are high-risk populations. Lesbian, gay, or bisexual students were more likely also to witness community violence and to be bullied, which is also a form of violence. So these are things that when we talk about preventing ACEs, we have the opportunity maybe to mitigate some of the negative impacts of those experiences. One of the recent studies that I looked at, interestingly enough, also talked about maternal mortality, which is defined as a maternal death that occurs during pregnancy, labor and delivery, or within the first year postpartum. And what they found was the leading cause associated with maternal mortality is mental health and the experience of adverse childhood experiences, as well as acute traumatic experiences that occur while in the adult life of the mother. So again, we don't think about that when we talk about, or we haven't in the past thought about those kinds of impacts when we talk about ACEs. When we talk about identifying risk factors for ACEs, just like we talk about with everything that we address, is that there are multiple levels where we can target prevention efforts. There is, of course, the individual level. And here, with respect to ACEs, you may be talking about altering community factors, decreasing violence, for example, substance use in the community and other things. They may occur within the family where you have parents who are suffering from substance use disorder or some other mental health or behavioral disorder. You have children of incarcerated parents, and you have children whose parents have come in contact with the law enforcement system, but have not necessarily been incarcerated. I did some training years ago with a group called the Police Treatment and Community Coalition, and they're a group that really looks at the wider impact of interface with law enforcement. And the training that I did was with the National Association for Children of Alcoholics, and basically heightened their awareness of how children are affected. And as we began to talk, there was like an aha moment. And they started talking about what happens when you arrest parents in front of the children. Where do the children go? How do they deal with the trauma of having their parents taken away very abruptly like that? Or when they witness violence, or when a parent is injured in the process of interacting with law enforcement. Those are things that, as law enforcement, they need to be aware of, and they need to be able to address on site and recognize that there's an adverse consequence there. When we move to the social environment, we're really talking more about policy and changes that will impact a wider segment of the population. I love this quote, and this is from Anda and Felitti, the original researchers of the ACE study. And what they said is that what is predictable is preventable. So we now know that ACEs, an adverse childhood experience, is pretty reliably predictable of an outcome in children. The other thing I want to say here, I want to make another point, which is that experiencing an ACE does not necessarily mean that you have experienced trauma. And that's something we still need further research to really understand. Some children are just resilient and they're able to process and overcome these experiences. Others are more vulnerable for any number of reasons. The cumulative effect, if the exposure is chronic over time, obviously that child is likely to have a more severe impact. If the child is isolated, if there are no supports in the community, all those things make a difference in terms of the outcome. And as you think about those kinds of interventions, many of you are already doing those things. So we have a question for you.
Which is,
Derek, go ahead.
Oh, I would be honored. You brought up some very interesting points so far that brings us to this question. And this is for you participants, and I want you to answer in the chat. How do you envision using ACE data to measure the impact of prevention efforts? You do so much work, and we have ACE data that's available. So how do you envision using that data to measure the impact of your prevention efforts? Please answer in the chat. Because once we have a vision, then we can start having a plan.
And I might add also, how many of you have actually thought of the ways in which your work is likely to impact ACEs in the community? Okay. No, I see Laurie says to address generational trauma, good.
Building protective factors by Dawn.
Mm-hmm. Okay, impact areas we need to focus on, good. That's some good responses there.
Excellent. Creating a community-wide needs assessment.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Meet
yeah.
people where they are. Very important. Good.
Jasmine says to create to team up and create a community that's informed about trauma, a trauma-informed community.
Hmm.
Eleanor says to better address needs and provide appropriate interventions based on the amount of severity of trauma. Ah,
Hmm.
important parental skills education, working with medical providers, specifically pediatricians. This is a very well-informed audience that has really different perspectives on how this data can be used. Interesting.
Hmm.
Marissa says, how we can help as well as understand that you have to meet them where they are in order to help. Help with parents with access to treatment, measuring resiliency. Marisol wants to help bring suicide rates down. Darcy, I like this one. Offer interventions for people experiencing trauma during pregnancy or during family
Hmm.
planning. Change the perspective on early intervention. Now that's really thinking upstream.
Hmm.
In that case, we'd already start making plans of how we're going to help those children before they're ever born. Amy says to break some generational chains. Seems like it's for many people it is here. There's as many ideas out there as well, Dr. Smith, on how this data can be used.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you all. As Derek said, you seem to be a very well-informed audience. Makes my job a lot easier. But I see a lot of, as all of you can read through the chat, the comments, and you can see that many of your colleagues are already thinking about how they can use ACE data. It's excellent. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one more, Dr. Smith. Tracking
Okay.
incarcerated or law enforcement involved parents over time to see if strategies like diversion programs are working. That's an
Excellent.
yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Yeah, and you're getting to evaluation, which I think is also very important. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. What I'm showing you now is an expanded framework for thinking of ACEs. And in your responses, I can hear that you're already thinking about some of these things. But as I mentioned before, we have a lot of work to do in terms of understanding resilience and what it means, how we can support resilience and build resilience in children who are traumatized. This particular slide really looks at how we can expand our definition, and it's called an empower action model. Rastistoff et al. Published an article on this just a couple of years ago, so it's relatively new. But again, if you look around the circle, you can see building resilience by learning skills to manage stress and nurture relationships, growing positive outcomes by promoting individual development, supporting individuals and families through positive relationships, creating positive environments, sharing resources. Those are things that should be very familiar to all of you because that's what you do on a daily basis. You're already preventing ACEs. What's a little bit different about this model that it goes beyond the social determinants of health to public policy, not just social norms, but public policy and advocating for changes at a much higher and systemic level. Well, we don't do a whole lot of that, but our educational programs can certainly influence public policy and create awareness so that there's more of a willingness, a public will to change policies. And around the outside of this diagram, you see race, equity, and inclusion, strong cultural identity, inclusive environments for all families. Those are some of the things we know need to happen if we're going to have healthy communities. Well, let's move on to talking about incorporating what we know about ACEs into your strategic plan. How many of you, and I can't see a show of hands, I guess, but it sounds like many of you have thought about how you might incorporate ACE prevention into what you're already doing. So let's go on. You'll have another opportunity to talk a little bit more about what you're currently doing. And I'm going to be very interested to hear. All of you are familiar with the spiff model, or most of you anyway, with the 5 petals of the spiff flower. And of course, very central to the spiff is sustainability and cultural competence. The first step in assessment is really to determine what are the risk factors in your community. And I saw some of you were already thinking about focusing in on the risks in your community. And there are many ways to do that. There are state and national databases that might be helpful, and there may be local data as well. What's important during this phase, as you go through the data that's available, is prioritizing what you can focus on. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So at the national level, there are a number of sources for data that can help you kind of craft your educational presentations around ACEs, and talking about the fact that these are common and they occur at all levels, and that they can have a very significant impact on what happens in adulthood. So of course you have the behavioral risk factor system, and questions have been added to the standard set of BRFIS questions, and some states are collecting this information. So you may want to check and see if that information is available for your state. Also, the youth risk behavior system is another national source that you can use, which would have some local data, at least state level data, if it's being collected in your state. The National Survey of Children's Health, which looks at mental illness and trauma in children and things like divorce. National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence, and the National Child Abuse and Neglect Data System. Now, many of these data sources are mirrored on the state level, and some of the information may even be available at a more local level. Once you begin to reach out and gather in and engage your partners in terms of collaboration. So, another question. Derek, do you want to take this one on?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll ask again for you to answer this question in your chat box. And it is, what are some other data sources that you have found helpful? And we ask this for multiple reasons. First of all, we want to know where you've been getting your data from. And we also want to provide resources to other people that are here right now, because a lot of times we help each other. We learn from each other. So wherever you're getting your data from, then you're also going to be helping your peers here today by sharing where you're getting that data from. So what are some other data sources that you have found helpful?
I see some of you are using DAWN data, drug abuse warning system data. There are a number of sources: the Healthy Youth, Michigan Profile. Okay.
Department of Health, incident reports with the juvenile justice system.
Excellent, yeah.
Local Medicaid and substance use treatment data. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is particularly interesting when we talk about substance use treatment data, because one of the things that I've found over the years working with organizations that support children in addicted families is that there are very few resources attached to the treatment programs that serve the adults. And so you may have two parents who are in a treatment program, but there are very few resources available for their children. So that's another area where I think we can do some work. Very good.
Also, Julie Hooks, we like that you put the link in there to where you get your data from. If there's anyone else who wants to share in there any links of where they get their data from, we welcome you to do that as well. As I said, we are all resources to each other.
Local health department and census data, good. Yeah.
Jasmine says, we are a local government unit and we utilize local data retrieved from our funded agencies and determine where there are disparities as far as services. We see where in our communities people are not receiving services and use that as a way to do more outreach and focus on those areas in need. That is next level. Often that is one of the hardest challenges people get, is getting that local data. Everyone wants to hold so close to their data, but the more we share with each other, the better off we are as a community, especially when it comes to trying to impact ACEs in a way that's going to be felt within the community. We have to share with each other what's going on. So excellent on your part in having such a strong collaborative relationship in your community to get that data.
Absolutely. Yeah, good examples of data sources. Well, once you have your data, we talked about the fact that ACEs are experiences that will impact an individual across, and continue to post if others of you have sources that you'd like to share with the group. I think that'd be very helpful because it will give people ideas as to where they can look within their own communities. But here, moving on to step 2, which is collaborating and building capacity, it becomes very important because we're talking about something a lifespan issue. So we need a lot of partners, and many of these partners are already being affected by the high rates of ACEs within their particular area of responsibility. People like law enforcement, medical personnel, pediatricians and others, obstetricians who are serving pregnant women, for example. Somebody mentioned juvenile justice. So kids who are coming into the juvenile justice system, very rarely are they screened for adverse childhood experiences. My experience working in juvenile justice in Georgia was that the majority of those kids had experienced ongoing adverse ACEs within their short lives. And, we had kids up to age 18. 18 was the cutoff for the adult system unless they had committed a violent crime. So you have an opportunity in these systems to really begin to think about intervening very early in the process so that those kids don't wind up in the adult system, which many of them unfortunately do. So who are the people that we can partner with? Well, this slide gives you a sense, and I'm sure all of you have, heard presentations on collaboration and who are the appropriate partners to work with. But here you see, there are a large group of folks out there who are looking at the results of ACEs in the populations that they serve. Certainly what happens in the workplace. I talked about the impact long-term in terms of employment issues, faith leaders, first responders, clearly. I mentioned law enforcement, educational professional. Whoops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. That was a mistake. Law enforcement, our colleagues who work in prevention, educating policymakers if you want to look at that system level impact. and of course, healthcare, both behavioral health care and other healthcare providers. So engaging all of these people is very important. The first screening tool was developed by Spalletti, and it's based on the initial identification of the 10 ACEs I talked to you about earlier. But there are now other tools that can be used in order to screen for ACE experiences in a population, particularly in children. Of course, I mentioned the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factors Survey, and there are some questions in there. If you do not have a local source of data on BRFIS, you can also look at the questions that are being used in some of these national surveys and maybe incorporate that into some of the work that you're doing locally in terms of data collection. Historically, most of the screening tools have focused on retrospective interviews of adults. So much of what is known is history. It's about history. It's not proactive. So really focusing on targeting those populations who are at risk, and again, that's what you do, is target at-risk populations, and identifying those who are currently experiencing ACEs and intervening. We know, for example, I mentioned some of the populations that are at high risk, but some studies have found that children who live in rural areas tend to have a higher risk of experiencing ACEs, and in most cases have less access to resources in their communities. Poverty is also associated with a higher risk. And of course, divorce, I mentioned earlier, and other kinds of family disruptions. Things like homelessness, foster care, intimate family violence. Pediatricians in particular, when they're seeing a child who has been abused, one of the things that many do not consider is the family system impact, and that in a family where you have several children, the siblings are also at risk for trauma, and they should also be assessed and referred for help. I see someone saying that they live in a very rural area and do not even call the Pride survey by its name, but call it a youth behavior survey. And then they have, and Lori says that she's presented this to parents. Excellent. In this politically charged environment that we live in right now, you do have to think about how you present this information and the language that you use, because some of it, like pride, can be inflammatory. And when you encounter that kind of resistance, you have difficulty getting beyond it. So thinking about who you're talking to, who your audience is, and also some of the political forces in play in your particular community can also be very important. So what I'm really getting at is that we need to think differently about how we are doing prevention. It's not necessarily that you have to do anything that's different, but to begin to think about how you are already impacting the frequency, the prevalence, better word, of adverse childhood experiences. What are you already doing that will have an impact on ACEs? So let's move on to planning. And you have some handouts. I forgot to call your attention to that, but you do have some handouts which will enable you to kind of follow along as I talk about the steps of the fifth and how we apply them. For planning, what are the evidence-based strategies that you already know about that seem to work in your community, and how can you adapt those or expand those to include ACE prevention? How are ACEs impacting the different sectors of your community? Beginning to think about who you need to educate and how you are going to raise awareness. Wow, there's some excellent comments going on in the chat box. Hopefully we'll come back, have time to really address some of those when we get toward the end of the presentation. You want to have community representation. And of course, those sectors that I mentioned earlier in this presentation just give you some of the sectors that you want to involve in this, because all of them are impacted to some extent by what happens when a child experiences that adverse, has that adverse experience. The other thing you want to think about in the planning stage, of course, is creating that logic model that will tell you the roadmap of where you're going, what you need to be doing, what you need to measure in terms of evaluation. I'm going to talk more about that in the next couple of slides. But really, during the early planning stages, you want to think about that then. You don't want to wait till everything is put together and then you go back in retrospect and say, oh, well, we could have measured this, we could have measured that. But to really think proactively in terms of what you see as being an evidence-based strategy that fits in your community and a good conceptual and practical fit in terms of ACEs, something that is known to make a difference in terms of those adverse childhood experiences. Selecting indicators is important, and indicators, and actually the next slide has a definition of that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But you want to be sure that what you're measuring, that the program you're implementing, is actually being implemented according to the plan that you developed. And that's fidelity. I know I'm speaking to people who've already heard this before. But the other thing is you want to also have benchmarks that will help you to monitor how well you're doing with implementation and also the quality of the implementation. What's going on as you are within the implementation process. And that's very important. That monitoring piece is something people forget to do. They may go in and measure process at a single point in time and not look at it again until it's time to do the final evaluation. But setting up your plan so that you can look in, take a peek, and see what's happening as the program is being implemented. And if you have to, you can tweak it so that it may become more effective. Now I'm going to move on to evaluation. And I call it evaluation planning because it should be a part of your plan. And you need to be thinking about how you are going to demonstrate that you've actually accomplished what you set out to do, how you're going to measure the changes that you hope will occur. And that's about selecting indicators. So CDC and others define an indicator as a measurable piece of data or information that can be used to determine if a program, a practice, or a policy is implemented as expected and is achieving desired outcomes. So you're looking at both things. You want to look at the fidelity issue and what will you measure to determine its fidelity? Perhaps things like recruitment, participation, retention, the number of people who attend a particular educational presentation, those kinds of things, and the evaluations associated with those events. Now, when you're selecting indicators and thinking again in the context of ACEs, you want to be sure that that indicator that you're selecting logically relates to the problem, which is adverse childhood experiences, and the outcomes. Well, we already know from research what the outcomes can be. What you want to look at in formulating your plan is which of the strategies that you are implementing have been shown to affect those risk factors associated with ACEs. And I know some of you, from what I've seen of the chat, have already done some of that and really given some thought to the things that you're already preventing, which also have an impact on the prevalence of ACEs within your community. You can address a risk factor, a protective factor, or look at the more systemic or contextual issues like community violence. What are you doing that impacts that? What are you doing to enable kids to process trauma, or how are you linking to resources that they can use when they experience trauma? And of course, the risk factors we talked about, having parents who have substance use disorders and mental health issues, or where there's violence in the home, those kinds of things are a risk for trauma. But the next step here is that you want to be sure you can measure it, okay? Is it measurable, first of all? And then do you have the capacity to collect that data to measure it? And that's maybe a little bit harder. So, working with your epidemiologist to figure out where you can find data that will enable you to look at those kinds of outcomes that are linked to ACEs, lie within your capacity to do so. And when you're linking out with partners, the different sectors that I talked about earlier, certainly many of those different groups are already collecting data on some of these factors. And it may simply be that you have to share data, or you need to share data with some of these folks in order to have that measurable data on outcomes. But like Anda and Saletti have said, we know that we can predict it, therefore we know that there's a way to prevent it. So when you're creating a monitoring and evaluation plan, I'm just going to walk through kind of the basics of a logic model, which I know many of you are already familiar with, but some of you may not be. When we talk about evaluation, we generally talk about two levels of evaluation, which is process, which in many cases means a single measurement in time. You decide halfway through, you're going to check in and see how your implementation process is going. Now, what I'm suggesting is that you establish a monitoring plan that will allow you to peek in at the data at multiple points in time to see whether or not the intervention is being implemented as it was intended, the fidelity issue, but also the quality issue, and whether it's meeting your expectations in terms of the kinds of changes that you would want to see. In your logic model, those become outputs. Those are measurable things, products of your intervention that you should be measuring. An example would be, how is the material being presented? Is the presentation consistent? Did the program reach the people that you wanted to reach? Who's coming and who's staying? That kind of data can be very important in terms of monitoring your overall implementation process. Outcome evaluation is the measurement of short, intermediate, or long-term outcomes. Many of the interventions that we'll be doing that relate to ACE, we can only go as far as intermediate because we don't follow people for their entire life. So we don't know if they die prematurely later on in life, and being able to link that back to what we've done. The outcomes we need to look at are the outcomes that we can influence. And you have to rely heavily on what the research tells us can be influenced and will impact the trauma that children experience, and provide them with the kind of skills and resources they need in order to cope with stress later in life. So we're always looking for change. Outcome is change. Something has to change. Otherwise we're not doing what we need to be doing. So you want to look at what changed as a result of what you did. And that can be tricky sometimes. But if you think it through, I'm sure much of what you're doing in the community is going to fit in terms of ACEs. The other thing, going back to outputs and outcomes, you could measure everything in the world, with outputs. And sometimes I get, when I teach or train on this, I get long lists of things that people want to measure. Practice parsimony. Look at those things that are directly related to whether or not you're going to achieve your outcome. And so you have to ask the question, if I measure, this doesn't happen, what effect is it going to have on short and long-term outcomes? Sometimes the things that you think you want to measure won't make a difference here in the short and long-term outcomes. So just a little bit of something to think about. This is just a very basic template of the logic modeling process. And I'm sure all of you know that there are many variations in terms of what the logic model graphic can look like. And what I always tell people is do what works for you. The logic model should be a roadmap that has utility for you and stakeholders and partners who are involved with you. Does it make sense? Can you look at it and understand the roadmap, where you're going, what you hope to achieve, what you're doing, and so forth? Generally, we start with what the community needs. And selecting those prevention targets. You know, where do we want to put our energy and our focus? Our inputs are the things that we'll need in order to make this plan happen. I know that you all are very experienced in doing that, whether it's people or resources or formal agreements with other agencies, whatever those things are. It's important to think those through early in the planning process, because you don't want to get halfway through and suddenly realize, oh my gosh, I should have done, you know, shoulda, coulda, woulda kind of thing. And I've talked about outputs and selecting the indicators to monitor your progress and fidelity. And lastly, which is the one that's most important and perhaps the most challenging, is how do you know when your strategy is successful? And you can see the arrows go around because these things feed each other. As you collect data, you may identify additional community needs, or perhaps begin to think about a different prevention target. You may want to modify next time around some things you want to do differently. So it is a cycle. This is an excellent resource if you've not looked at it. It's a CDC resource, Preventing Adverse Childhood Experiences. And they really look at the research and also make a number of recommendations about strategies that may impact adverse childhood experiences. And they've come up with 6 different strategies, broadly defined, but then within the document, they do provide some examples. So, for example, strengthening economic support for families, promoting social norms that protect against violence and adversity. Many of you do that already. You are educating, raising awareness about things like bullying, about substance use, about violence in the community, all of those kinds of things. Ensuring a strong start for families, and that's when you get into the early childhood kinds of strategies. You know, looking at parenting skills, which is the next one, to help parents be better parents, but also looking at helping young people handle stress and emotions and to tackle everyday challenges. Many of the programs, the evidence-based programs that we implement, focus on those things. We do not measure changes in those domains. So what I'm suggesting to you is to think again about what you're doing and the impact of what you're doing on what we know will affect long-term behavior and outcomes. Connecting youth to caring adults and activities. Of course you do that. You know, that's what you do as preventionists. And to intervene to lessen immediate and long-term harms. That's almost a definition of prevention. So as you look at these 6 strategies, it's very clear that you're already doing many of these things. And as I look at what people are posting in the chat, there's some wonderful stuff there. I hope we can capture that there and share it with people so they'll have it after the webinar. Well, let's just take one of those. And I chose the intervene to lessen immediate and long-term harm. Okay, so that's going to be the strategy that we're going to focus on for our prevention planning in this hypothetical example. So here's your logic model template. And again, you have a handout that's available to you, which you can follow along if you'd like to in terms of building that logic model. As I said before, you start with your priorities. Well, we've already determined that we got to do something about the immediate and long-term harm of adverse childhood experiences. So that's our need we'll work with. So how are we going to do that? Well, we want to increase community awareness of risk and protective factors. That's one goal. Now, we can have multiple goals. I just selected one for this little demonstration. So how will we do that? How will we increase community awareness? Thinking through improving the recognition of potential ACEs and the risk factors associated with them, increasing mental health supports for children, increasing help-seeking behavior, reducing suicidal thoughts. Okay, those are some of the objectives that we're going to focus on. So what do we need? Well, we got to have the educational materials, and there's some great resources, and Derek later on will share with you some case studies that you may find helpful to look at how others have worked with AIDS in terms of prevention planning. You want to engage all of your stakeholders and community gatekeepers. And then, of course, you have to develop that intervention plan, that implementation plan for your intervention. And that often involves working with your partners to do. So this piece, putting together your inputs, can be time consuming and need to be carefully thought out, which I know you all do anyway, but also thinking through the ACE perspective. So, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to teach folks how to recognize the symptoms of ACE exposure, teach them about the risk factors, teach them about the behavioral symptoms that you may see in children and the children who are at highest risk. Provide some modeling for help-seeking behavior for folks, including kids, you know, where you can go for help if you have this problem in your family. And then building up the resources that are available once a child who's been exposed is identified, what happens to them? Are there resources in the community that will work with traumatized children? Whatever the risk factor is for those children. And that's, you know, these are educational goals that you have with everybody. You know, the students themselves, so that they better understand why they feel the way they do because of what happened to them, their parents, the school staff, mental health and medical providers. And of course, there are many other gatekeepers in the community. And here you'll decide, you know, where you want to put your focus, whether it's on the schools or on the medical providers or others. Treatment providers would be another group that you might want to look at. So for your output, you want to know how many educational presentations did you do? That's one thing that you'll look at to be sure that you're actually carrying this out the way that you thought you would. And of course, you'll have a lot more detail here in terms of how you're going to do that. And number three, you might look at the number of providers that you've interfaced with who are interested in developing additional resources for children who are affected. And you want to be sure that you're reaching your intended audience, which would be the groups down here. How will you know that what you've done has worked? Well, again, you're not looking across the lifespan to prevent diabetes or to prevent depression and mortality when they become adults. You're looking in the short term in terms of what you actually impact with your activities in your prevention plan. One of the things you hope will happen is that people will become more aware of what ACEs are. They'll be more aware of how you identify children who've been exposed to ACEs and the treatment options or referral options that are available to them. And there have been some studies actually which have looked at educational presentations on ACEs. And sorry, my dog is barking. And looking at whether or not the information is applied in a way that will affect the youth who are being screened or who are being identified. One of the more upsetting things, I think, is that what some of those studies have indicated is that health professionals in general are not as well educated about the pervasive effects of ACEs. And even when they understand what ACEs are and what the risk factors are, understanding the role that they can play is often something that needs to be addressed. Many of the programs that have been developed are developed in a research setting. They don't take into account the everyday limitations of the clinical setting. And so working with physicians as a partner to really think through, well, what can we do differently that will contribute to the prevention of ACEs? You know, one of the things very simply might be addressing, first of all, the trauma in the index child who comes in because they have a bruise or they broke an arm, but also looking at the family system and the siblings in that system and how they've been affected. One example I sometimes give here, when I was director of a treatment program in Atlanta, we had a program, a residential program for pregnant and parenting women and their children up to age 10. And we had a little boy and his sister who came in with their mother, who was a substance abuser. And the baby was about 10 months old, I think. The little boy was 7. But when he came in, he would not interact with staff, and he was very protective of his sister. He would not leave her side. So even when we tried to engage him in age-appropriate activities, he would not participate. He would not leave his sister. The reason for that is that he learned in his experience not to trust adults, and he was the primary caregiver for that 10-month-old child. You know, we often don't think about, you know, the family system and how it affects those children. So we had to work with him to learn to trust and allow him to come back and check on his sister periodically to be sure that she was okay. And it took time. It took time. He was a child who hadn't learned to play, who hadn't learned to engage with peers, etc. So there are things that you can do, at that stage to help support children experiencing ACEs. Making resources available so that families and individuals who are experiencing ACEs can seek help, you know, finding out in the community where are the sources of help and support in the community. And also, as you work with your partners in collaboration, think about how you can build additional resources within the community. And then, of course, it's increasing the identification and referral of those children once you've identified those resources. So these are the things that are going to change as a direct result of what you do here, okay? And like I said, you're probably already doing a lot of this anyway. So I'm going to kind of stop here to give you some time to kind of think about some of what we've been talking about. I know people have been posting in the chat, and Derek, I don't know if you've been keeping track of all of that. But if you have questions, I want to be able to address them. There's been a lot of excellent information shared in the chat. You know, some of you are saying, okay, there's so many of you posting. I can't go through all of the comments that have been made. But, you know, are there any questions that you have at this point? You know, and again, I encourage you to look at the comments that have been posted in the chat, and hopefully Derek can share those with you so that you'll have them after the presentation, because there's some wonderful links to resources, suggestions in terms of data sources and so on and so forth. So as you're thinking of, sorry, Derek, go ahead.
Oh, no. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
Well, as Dr. Smith was saying, as you're contemplating this question, we want to hear from you. This is your opportunity to ask us some questions. A lot of times, some things you may not have been able to type. We have given you permission now to open your microphone. If you feel more comfortable just asking your question directly to us, you can open your mic and you can ask that question. We're going to do this for about 5 minutes. So it's an open floor right now for about 5 minutes if you want to open your mic and ask your question. Chat, you can answer the question, what does ACE prevention how does ACE prevention fit within your prevention plan or activities? So who would like to go first? What is your question?
I can go first. I have a question. Thank you first off for this information. It's been very comprehensive and super informative. So I work in a healthcare setting. I'm working on forming some strategies for prevention and treatment for our members who have substance use. And I'm just thinking, and you've given me a lot to think about, but when it comes, I guess, specifically to substance use in the prevention realm with ACE, where would you start?
Yeah, that's the hard question. But I think you start with the things that you're already doing. It sounds like you know, you're already working with the treatment community. You know, as I mentioned, children who grow up in substance use disordered homes are certainly at high risk. Increasing awareness of the need to address the possibility of trauma in those children and establishing some resources for referral for those treatment programs when those families are identified is certainly a good place to start. You know, for what, go ahead, I think I heard you say something.
I was just saying that is a good place to start, actually. Thank you. I hadn't thought about that.
Okay.
Steph Carlson had a question. If you want to open your mic to elaborate on that one. But the question was, is anyone having issues with folks pushing back on the youth surveys that ask about the LGBTQ community?
Sure. So in our community, we had several schools get pushback from parents about not doing the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is a primary place that we get a lot of our data, not just us, but public health and many other entities use it. And we had a lot of parents who were up in arms this year for the first time, even though they've been asking the question about how do you identify for probably 4 years. But this was the first year that parents, you know, got all up in front of people at the school board meeting and were upset about how could you offer this survey and blah, blah, blah. I just wondered if anyone else was having issues and what they did, because when it got political, we were told to just be quiet.
Yeah, this is just kind of a strange time that we're in. And I live in Florida, so I'm very aware of the kind of political pushback you get. That's a tough one. And anytime you intervene with children, and you know, like you said, anybody else who has some suggestions, we're open to them. But when you deal with interventions with a minor, parental consent is mandatory in most cases. And if a parent is the problem, you know, if it's violence in the home or substance use or mental health issues, they don't want that made public. And I know that's some of the pushback that you may be getting. You know, ensuring confidentiality and being very clear that this information doesn't get shared is important. But again, you're going to have to work with partners and figure out how to get around it. You know, at what point do you override parental issues in order to help the child, and how do you do that? You may not be able to do that as a prevention specialist, but if the issue is serious enough in the family, then you may have to look for the Family and Children's Services or law enforcement to help you intervene.
I think you'll like this one, Dr. Iris. It's from Jasmine Lopez, and it said, it's essential. Our community is very diverse, from race, ethnicity to socioeconomic status, and we need to break silos and collaborate with all sectors, police, education, religious institutions, social service agencies, etc., to provide resources that are preventative and equitable. And I think you touched on that, and if you wanted to expand more on that related to this this topic, then it may be appreciated.
Yeah. Well, I definitely agree with that, and as I talked about earlier, there's so many sectors that are impacted by ACEs, though they may not realize it. The police group I work with, which is Police Treatment, I always get the acronym, PCC, Community Collaborative, Police Treatment and Community Collaborative, may be a good resource, actually, because they do a lot of training. They're mainly for law enforcement, but they do bring in mental health, social work. I mentioned that they brought in the National Association for Children of Alcoholics. So they're interested in these kinds of issues, and they really want to make a difference. And they've had some wonderful results from it. You can go to their website, and I'll post it in the chat for you, and look at some of the trainings, many of which are online, which may be very helpful to you. So I think you just have to reach out and figure out with your collaboration who's doing what and how can you work together to make a difference. And I know in the LGBTQ community, it's very distressing, some of the politics that have emerged recently around that. And like I said, I live in Florida, so on a daily basis, I'm confronting that kind of stuff. That's difficult. You also have to recognize that you will have limitations and try not to let that frustrate you. Do what you can along the avenues that are open for you. And maybe you need to, come at it from another direction. Instead of going to the PTA, go to law enforcement and talk to them about the domestic violence cases that they have had to intervene with, or substance abuse with juvenile justice as the kids are coming into the juvenile justice system. Do something with them there because they're in the custody of the state, which gives you a little more flexibility. So it's tough.
Brenda, just to acknowledge your response, you said the ACE information could bridge the gap between schools and parents, and we agree with you. You also say oftentimes parents refuse to accept the trauma their child has experienced as a result of their substance abuse. This could be used in a private setting. And we actually have an upcoming program on that that we're going to share with you as well today. I'll send everyone a link to it in the chat when we get a few more slides down, but it's going to be called Continuing the Conversation About ACEs. ACEs Talk with Family and Friends Workshop, and that's going to be on July the 13th, but I'll share the links for registration with you as well, because those are important, critical conversations to start having in communities.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of what you can do also is just continue to make the case for why it's important to identify children who are traumatized because of these kinds of risk factors, and the fact that down the road, these ACEs are going to impact almost every sector of the community. You have to gather your support in terms of advocacy and education.
Also, Carrie Howe sighed, and she's very concerned about Iowa because they've opted out of the National Youth Risk Behavioral Survey for the state administered, and it does not ask questions about gender identity, abuse, violence, or sexual health. She says, and many districts, especially in urban areas, have even opted out of the IYS because of survey fatigue caused by the federal mandated conditions for learning surveys. And even in those conditions, I think it's important that you look at some of the other strategies for collecting data, but I'm going to ask Dr. Smith to comment on that.
Yeah, I would agree. To look at other ways to collect that data. And some of it may be qualitative data that you're collecting. If survey fatigue is a big issue, you may have to sample rather than having a broad-based community survey like YRBS or the Iowa Youth Survey, and look specifically at your community. Talk to the kids, talk to the families. I don't know what I can say that will make, that's a tough one. It's a tough one to address, but I think there are alternative data collection strategies that you can use. And there are also other sources of data within the community already being collected. Emergency room data. If you are able to partner with the emergency rooms within your community and talk with them about the children who are coming in and the kinds of situations they're experiencing. We're seeing a lot of emergency room visits now by children. And of course, a lot of those children coming in, a lot of those visits are for mental health issues. And a lot of those mental health issues are related to ACEs. So helping them, emergency rooms, to understand how to identify a child who is in need of some kind of trauma intervention, linking them to the resources in the community, which can be helpful for those children, and thinking, as I mentioned before, thinking about the whole family system and not just the child who walks into the emergency room. We're seeing a lot of ER visits with suicide attempts and ideation. Again, a lot of that is coming from previous exposure to trauma, and being able to identify that, even if it's one or two questions that are asked clinically, is a beginning. And as a preventionist, you can begin to look at those resources so that when you're doing your presentation and they say, well, I had this kid, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do now, you can come and say, well, we identified A, B, C, and D, and these are programs that may be helpful. None of us can do it all by ourselves, and we know that. We have to reach out and partner. And together, I think we can as a community, we can make a difference.
So true. With that said, let's move on to the next slide, Dr. Smith.
Okay.
We've added these 3 case studies for you to use as resources. Case studies are valuable tools for understanding complex issues and applying theoretical knowledge and learning from real life examples and enhancing problem solving skills is something that you guys do on a regular basis. So these 3 case studies provided practical insights that contribute to knowledge and development when it comes to utilizing that ACE data. See, the use of the ACE data led to the appropriations of federal funding for the prevention of ACEs in Oklahoma. That's one example there, and I'll put the link so y'all can have that also. But also in Washington was one of the first states to add the ACE module to their behavioral risk factor surveillance systems in 2009 to assess the prevalence of ACEs in its adult population and inform prevention actions. So this case study highlighted how Washington supported state-specific ACE data collection, how they use their ACE data to inform prevention efforts, and it also provides examples of Washington's next steps in child maltreatment prevention work. In the third case study, in Wisconsin, the ACE data was used to develop a common language around child mistreatment and maltreatment that kept practitioners focused on the same goal, which is so important in the work that we do. It also contributed to collaboration and also to prevention efforts and actions across multiple sectors. So I'm going to put those links into the chat for you. That first one, that's Oklahoma. These are really in a great format as well, so it's easy for you to download. If you go to these like right now, you'll be able to print these out and use them immediately, start evaluating this in contrast to some of the goals and ways that you said you wanted to use your ACE data. Because if it's already been done before, then, as so many people say, we don't have to recreate the wheel. We can learn from others. So if you see how others have utilized their ACE data and it's in line with the way that a goal that you have and how you want to utilize your ACE data, then this will be useful in expediting the process as well for you. So we hope that you will use what you've learned here today when confronted with a complex situation in your state. And we know all of our situations are complicated. But the ones that are related to ACEs are especially important to us because we know for a fact that if we do nothing, things will only get worse. We learn so much from the ACE study. And as Dr. Smith told us, I mean, when it comes to that flower growing, you know, we don't blame the flower because it doesn't bloom. We go and we fix the environment, and doing this work related to ACEs fixes the environment, and it helps those children, those little flowers, to start growing. There was a poem that I often recited when I was growing up about I think it was from Tupac, about the rose that grew from concrete. And that's what it's like in a lot of these communities. We have these roses that are somehow finding a way to break through the concrete and still bloom. But that's not the case for every single one of them. We could have a garden out there if we can start getting rid of the concrete so that all the flowers in our community, all our children can bloom. It's not just data anymore. This is now, when you look at ACE data, I want you to see it as your tool, because prevention professionals like you are challenged to analyze information every day. You do it. You get a hold of this information, you analyze it. And you're also challenged to identify relevant factors. ACEs is relevant. And you also have the skills within you, and you utilize them to consider alternative solutions. You guys are the best at coming up with alternative solutions. So we ask you to use the information that you learned today and that Dr. Smith has shared with you to make some informed decisions now. Learn the ACE data within your community and make informed decisions on how you provide prevention services. So down the road, we can start seeing that environment improve, the concrete disappearing, and more of the youth, our children, growing into roses that they all have the possibility of becoming. We encourage you to utilize the evidence-based thinking skills you've developed over these years and your ability to evaluate multiple perspectives, because there are so many perspectives in our community. And that's why it's important to get everyone together. We need everyone together in order to make these changes. They are crucial for tackling this real world problem that's related to ACEs effectively. Next slide.
Oh.
Next slide.
It's coming.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. As you all know, it's not over until the paperwork's done. This is a survey link. We need your evaluation. We need to know how we did today. We need to know what we need to do in the future, because you're not in this alone. Your PTTC is here to support you in all the work that you're doing, especially in Region 6. But as we know here, we have people here from all over the United States. So many people are concerned about this topic. I think I saw someone here from Maine earlier. So we know this is a real problem that's affecting all of our communities. And together, we can work to fix it. Next slide. So, as promised, I'm putting a link now into the chat box for you. This is a registration link for our upcoming program called Continuing the Conversation About ACEs. Yes, we are going to continue the conversation. And this is the one for ACE Talk with Family and Friends. It's a workshop, and it's going to teach the skills that are needed to have these critical conversations within our community. And we hope that each and every one of you that are here today will also sign up to be a part of this workshop as well, because we're building on this. We don't see this ever as an end until we can end all ACEs within the community, and all children will have the opportunity to grow up and live their best lives.